I asked Connie in introducing me, at least, to try to provide lowered expectations, but she's blown that already before we began. But I'm honored to be here between John and Mark to talk about personality, I guess, among all others, is the one I most admired, Thomas Jefferson. Part of it has to do with his eloquence and his, well, all the things that John say in the Bible here about him, you know. But if you think of Thomas Jefferson as a politician and think of the art of power, think of how many of us identify power and politicians with negative, sort of seamy aspects of public life, you can come away with some of the rust of his relationships with a whole panoply of people, including many revered founders, including George Washington, the father of our country. And but for tonight, there are, it seems to me, two anecdotes that John gives us on Jefferson that really sort of, I think, provide sense of appreciation for why we're here. And one of them has to do with Jefferson as a young man with his mother visiting a friend, and word comes that the family home place has been destroyed by fire. Blow to him, you know. And as John points out, his first question is, was the library destroyed? And the slave who brings the bad news says yes. And so were all of the books. And Jefferson later says, would to God it had been money. The books were worth 250 pounds. And the second anecdote that strikes me as fitting for tonight and sort of as a way to lead into, you know, it comes a time, War of 1812, when the British literally burn 3,000 books that belong to the government. And it is Jefferson who comes forward, offers to sell his library of 6,000 books. And as John points out, that's the core of the volumes that are part of the Library of Congress. And I'd like to just be, with those two thoughts, illustrating, I think, his deep love of learning and literature and his deep affection for the written word. Ask you, Mark, tell us about this Library of Congress and Jefferson's books and your effort to recreate what was once there.
Sure, I'll make that a short story. And I will say that the two events that were just raised are pivotal to the National Library today. They make those two fires shape the Library of Congress. The Shadwell fire, the family home, in which Jefferson asks immediately, what about the books? Prompts him as a very young man, young for this kind of activity, to vow that he will rebuild this library, but this time it will be even better and will document the whole of human experience, the whole of human endeavor. He was 26 at the time, I believe, and capable of making such statements. He then spends 50 years of his life doing exactly that. So that when the next fire in the story that comes along, when the English deliberately burn the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury, the Arsenal, and destroy Washington in 26 hours, and with it the Congressional Library, Jefferson realizes that the mission that he had, which was to build this library in the spirit of what Diderot was talking about with the encyclopedia, to gather all the knowledge that's available in the world and to make it available to generations to come, that he suddenly had a moment in which he realized that his library could stay together and remain permanent, and that it would be a viable solution to this loss. And so sold his library, 6,487 volumes, for a minimal amount of money, $23,000. And it became the core and the basis of the Library of Congress. However, it immediately arrived as the Library of Congress, and although Jefferson's books were annotated in a catalog as having belonged to Jefferson, new books arrived and filled in spaces around Jefferson's library, so that very quickly you see that his books became the foundation of what was then called the Library of Congress. And for 35 years, what Jefferson had sold to the American people to replace the loss of damage that had been done by the vandalism of the English, created a library that was international in scope, comprehensive, collecting attempts in all fields, open to languages, organized in a way in which the vast array of subjects of interest to the human mind were reflected. And a library was born until Christmas Eve, as I like to say, it always happens in Christmas Eve in Washington. On Christmas Eve, in 1851, there was a chimney fire and in the Capitol, and 2/3 of Thomas Jefferson's books, along with other books, were destroyed. And so this great treasure that helped rekindle a nation, helped provide information to a fledgling nation, suddenly had been reduced to ashes. Nevertheless, the spirit of the Library of Congress persisted. A new building, fireproof building, was built in 1897, later named after Thomas Jefferson in honor of his founding collection. And by the time we got to the bicentennial of the Library of Congress in the year 2000, we launched a program to reconstruct the 1815 Thomas Jefferson book collection. And that meant that I had to find 2/3 of the books that Jefferson had sold in 1815, which is roughly about 4,000 volumes, that matched exactly the books that Jefferson owned. Now, as John will tell you, I'm sure, repeatedly, Jefferson documented a good deal of his life, not the least of which was how he spent his money on books. So it is actually possible for us to go through his papers. We belong to a small club of people who have read Jefferson's papers from
He was on the spectrum.
Yeah. So it's a very small group.
So are we. Yeah, that's right.
That's right. That's right. It's a very small group. To reconstruct and to come up with a desiderata. And over the last 16 years of my life, we have been accumulating books, first by going through the Library of Congress collections to find matching copies, and then, if not available, buying them on the market to reconstruct the collection as it came in 1815. So we started with desiderata of 4,000. We're down to less than 250. I'm hanging on to those last 250 as job security, I think. But the process, similar to what I'm sure John will talk about for me, was that in the process of hunting for these books, in fact, recreating the act of buying these books in groups, in clusters, in moments, allowed me to re-experience, or to experience, what must have been happening for Jefferson at certain moments. As a boxload of books arrived with some German Enlightenment thinkers and some Italian poetry and some architecture, and there is a kind of bibliofest that goes on in Jefferson's life from time to time. It gave me a window to Jefferson's mind that's oftentimes different from looking at him in a different setting, and I think gives us a chance to rediscover the materials that shaped his thinking, led him to come to certain conclusions, and actually guided the way in which he led his life. So, for those of you who come to the Library of Congress, the Jefferson Collection is now a permanent exhibit. It's in a lovely round circle of books. That was actually the slide that was up when you came in. which is the way he wanted it displayed and yet never managed to do so in Monticello, to have it in the circle. And it's, at the moment, the most popular exhibition at the Library of Congress, and you get to see Jefferson's universe recreated.
Could I just ask you one, 250 more, what are the odds that you can come up with those 250 volumes?
There are a couple of books that are groaners. That is, they're probably chapters or tear sheets that got miscatalogued. They don't really exist. We can't find them. There are small. Jefferson was not. Jefferson liked detail, and so some of his pamphlets are very specific. And so I'm looking for an Italian pamphlet on the pomegranate tree. Which is more interesting when you try and find the world's leading expert on pomegranate trees, which is not an easy thing to do, to see if he might hear of it. They're books that people have never heard of. There's one book which is a navigator book, which if it ever came to market would be a brawl at an auction, which means we won't get it. It's a much sought after the American Compass, which is a very, very, very rare American book, and we would never be able to afford it to acquire it. But some of them are quite mundane. They just represent books that dealers don't carry today or don't show up in auction, and also represent an aspect of Jefferson, which is he didn't like fancy books. He liked books of a handy size, he said. And he didn't like them with a lot of frill, and he just liked clean white paper and the modern style on the binding. And he liked them of a certain size, which meant they were often Dublin editions, which are piracies mostly, and are even harder to find on the market than the real editions now. So it kind of represented his he's not a connoisseur collector, he's a very practical academic or a scholar. And so those 250 books probably will never finish the list. We still are getting books in, though.
Good luck. Good luck.
That's right.
I think you've got long tenure. I want to ask you about this personality.
Mark. About Mark.
Not that one.
No, no.
What about Mark? Yeah.
The personality about whom the Art of Power is written. I think as we read your book and I think sort of rediscover Thomas Jefferson, and maybe it's just my instinct as a journalist, I'm drawn again and again and again to the conflicts that engage him. You quote him as saying, "May we outlive our enemies," and he had enemies, and still we have this intellectual who's so committed to learning and to literature. How does that gut-cutting politician and this this intellectual who's so committed not just to learning himself but having the society learn? Mm-hmm. How do those two personalities fit within that skull?
They actually do fit quite well. I want to say thank you all for coming. This is the largest gathering of talent in one place since John Seigenthaler dined alone. And so I wanted to quickly point that out.
You got that, Dolores?
I've been waiting. That's right. Actually, when Dolores died. So I'm delighted to be here. Here's why they coexist. Jefferson was I love this phrase, a gut-cutting politician, but in the service of the survival and success of American liberty. That was the principle on which he would not compromise. Anything else was up for grabs. As we know, his constitutional views, he was, in his Claude Rains moment, he was shocked that anyone would think we needed a constitutional amendment to buy Louisiana because he realized he needed to do it fast. If Alexander Hamilton had tried to do that, Jefferson, this is a technical historical phrase, his head would have exploded. He was a terrifically practical man because he believed that liberty required a pragmatic vision, a pragmatic sense. what Mark does so well and what Jefferson was doing is he believed that learning and the life of the mind were ultimately as vital to the preservation of liberty as shrewd political instincts were. Because if you did not have an educated populace, if you did not have educated generations who could see that there was no thing new under the sun, Thucydides dealt with a lot of this stuff too. If you didn't have that appreciation of the complexity of the past, and all the way unto the pomegranates and the macaroni and everything else he read about, if the life of the mind was not rich, one would not be as inclined to fight for a culture in which you had the freedom to choose to pursue those subjects. And to my sense is that one of the reasons I think Jefferson is the founder who charms us most is not only because he defended the freedom of the press so well, but because he's really the political embodiment, and the books are the literary embodiment of a fundamental shift that was going on in the West, right? So the generation before Jefferson, everything was vertical. Kings, nobles, priests, popes, everything came from above down. What was happening with Gutenberg, with the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, with the rise of the bourgeoisie, with the incredible ease, the relative ease with which books could be printed and published and disseminated, life was becoming horizontal. For white people, let's be clear. But that shift, and the American Revolution was the political embodiment of the horizontalization, I think, of life in the West. And so suddenly you did not cede your rights of understanding. In Virginia, if you were a Quaker, it was not guaranteed that you would have custody of your children because you were not an observing Anglican. As an Episcopalian, and there are only 6 of us, I'm kind of for an established church now, but that's different. God's frozen people need some help. But that's what happened, and the life of the mind. And I think one of the vital lessons of Jefferson, and we're seeing it at this hour with Mark's employer, it's our government, but is that the life of the mind and the life of politics should not be separate countries. They should be contiguous states with porous borders. And that's what Jefferson, I think, embodied.
You know, you say that, and I found out so much more about him from The Art of Power. And of course, I was looking for power at every turn of the page, every new chapter. And suddenly I find out that he's a collector not only of books, but of fossils.
Yes.
And he turns the president's mansion. I mean, there are teeth and tusks.
Yep.
And forelegs, and I mean, what is this, John?
In fact, it was not matched until Jackson just piled up his victims. Little local plug there.
Good.
I remember being very excited when I found that letter. There's a letter where he makes a list. It's not yet in the Princeton version of the papers. By the grace of the Princeton Library, I had an early transcript of it. It's a list of what Jefferson wanted from Lewis and Clark. And it was bones and teeth and tusks and leather, hides, all sorts of things. And he really wanted, Zebulon Pike brought stuff back too, he really wanted the White House to be a center of culture. And of course, you could walk in and out of the house in those days. So he set aside a room on the first floor and put all this stuff out. It was the world's first discovery museum. He wanted people to see this because, again, the life of the mind was going to create a richer republic, lowercase r. Remember, he's dealing with all these fellas. It was dealing with a world in which they believed that the country itself was only as good as the sum of the parts. And that meant our personal virtue, it meant our intellectual curiosity, it meant our political orientation But all of it was tied up together. And if he could raise the tone, that's what was behind a lot of the wine selections. It was behind his bringing back ice cream, thankfully. That's the only thing my children were excited about, Thomas Jefferson, when I told them that. Bringing back pasta. This man wrote letter after letter searching for the perfect dressing for his salads. I mean, this was a man, he was the first foodie in many ways. And it wasn't just because he was a man of eclectic interest, though he was. I believe he genuinely saw these things as building blocks to a vibrant republic.
He often spoke about this nature of the true Republican, the Patriot Republican, as somebody who has gained this through a very detailed understanding, a slow accumulation of fact. He bemoans at one point that it seems the trend today that where at once only a poet seems to have been born with the trait of poetry. Today it seems that there are born politicians and born doctors,
right.
and bemoans the fact that we've lost this notion of hard work and accumulation of a series of facts that give you a certain knowledge from which you can act. Jefferson's very concerned around the issue of how the history of England is presented in England and this country, because at the very foundation of that is the belief in the virtue of the American Revolution. This kind of Whig notion that all the struggles that have happened in England came not from the power and abuse of power of royalty, but instead from the hue and cry of the gathered citizenry in a democratic impulse. And it goes all the way back to what they call the Saxon myth, which is that the Saxons gave up their rights to the Normans. Jefferson spends a good deal of time trying to promote a particular history of England in order to avoid this sort of anti-Whig, pro-royalty history of England that Hume writes, which is a very popular history at the time. And in so doing exposes this notion of fact, yes, style and theory when applied, and it has to be the right history. And that's what guides what you're describing, this notion that there is the need to find and document the correct version of this story.
Right.
There's go ahead.
So, the other great example, and that's a marvelous one, because whoever controlled English history, particularly early on, controlled the fate of the Revolution. Mm-hmm. Because we forget, this was British North America. A third, scholars are down to about 20%, but 1 in 5 Americans were loyalists. So if you could control British history and show that the ministers of George III and George III had corrupted the English tradition of liberty, it made the Revolution a fairer outcome. The other great example, which goes to what John and I spend our time doing, which is high level insight into political gossip. I don't know why I'm dragging you into this. I'm going to use a technical phrase here. It drove Jefferson bananas that John Marshall had written a 5-volume life of George Washington that was becoming the standard life of Washington, and as important, if not more important, of the Federalist administration in the first 12 years of the constitutional order. To say that Jefferson did not come out well in John Marshall's book is to say that Satan had a good turn in the New Testament. He spent endless...
And they were cousins?
Oh, God. Well, and as we know, that makes it worse. There's no quarrel like a family quarrel. But he spent an enormous amount of time in his correspondence trying to commission books, commission new histories of the early part of the constitutional order to counteract the Washington life that he believed totally minimized his achievements.
He says, in response to that Washington biography, in denying the stories that come out, the suggestion that Washington committed suicide by archive.
Right.
And then goes on to write to Adams that he had found a particularly good biographer that he thinks that should probably do both of their stories now.
Right.
in this desperate attempt to control this poison. He's always looking for the poison, the poison of Toryism, the
Right.
poison of this rewriting of history.
Right. And Adams, who was second to no founder in his regard for himself. There's an Adams person I was just attacking. There you are. Hi. We've been doing this for 2 years now.
Odd choice.
Said, if you read the histories, you would think that the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolution just sprung from Washington's head like Minerva. And so, and it drove Adams, again, crazy that Jefferson got all the credit for the Declaration of Independence because it had been a committee, it had been edited very well. He called it, Adams dismissively called the Declaration a theatrical performance, and Jefferson ran away with the glory of all of it.
Mm-hmm. And yet, at the moment of the library coming to the Library of Congress, the gentlemen have reconciled the differences. They're now corresponding with each other, and they're both feeling the distance from the actual revolutionary event, and are both, Adams more so than Jefferson, feeling as if they've been forgotten. Adams, when he discovers that Jefferson has sold his library, if you can imagine these two communicating like this, Adams writes to Jefferson upon learning of the sale of the library and says, I envy you at least this immortality, that you will at least be remembered because of your library. So although there is this kind of creating priority between the two of them, there's also a sense that, especially for Jefferson, this must have been most vexing, that the history was rewriting itself in his presence, and they were being written out. It was sort of the feeling they had.
And he continues to collect. Collect literature. Baxter, you've pointed out, Baxter's History of England, essays on astronomy, geography, maps of Asia, the other continents.
The Koran.
Yeah, and the Koran. Well, speaking of the Koran, I have a question.
Yeah.
2007, your state, Minnesota, 5th District, elects first Muslim in history to the United States Congress. He announces he's going to be sworn in on the Koran. And all hell breaks loose. There was a vicious reaction. It was like he was a member of Al Qaeda, and then suddenly Jefferson's library sort of brings us back to the reality that we are a diverse people, and beyond that, there is a legacy of religious liberty in this country. Do you have anything to do with Keith Ellison getting that copy of the Koran?
Keith Ellison represents my hometown in Minnesota. That was learned later on in the story. Ellison had been receiving a lot of critique, especially from an individual who represented the county that happened to be the home of Monticello, so there was a certain kind of lovely symmetry going on here. And people who are not familiar with how members of Congress are sworn in, the real swearing in happens in the House, where everyone simply raises their hand and says, I swear. The ceremony with the Bibles and the Constitutions and the Korans is a photo opportunity and is not the official swearing in. So we have to put it into this context. This is what the thunderstorm was about. Representative Ellison received an anonymous phone call telling him that there was a Koran in the Thomas Jefferson collection, and this person was sure that if asked, that the library would probably let him use it. And so the next day, Representative Ellison called me and asked if there was a Koran in the Thomas Jefferson collection, and I said yes, there was, and could he use it, and I said yes.
We're reading Nancy Drew at my house. I'm going to unleash my 9-year-old on this mysterious tip.
This is Jefferson and Hume.
Yeah.
And Baxter is cutting out all the unimportant parts of the story.
Got it.
What was interesting is...
We won't go back to the anonymous call and from whence it came.
No.
So it, for me, a very poetic moment, because Jefferson's books included a Koran, a 1764 second printing of a translation from the Arabic to the English, an important translation that first really introduced a less biased language of the Koran to Europe. The French translations were full of very heavy-handed kind of language. And resided in Jefferson's collection in a section of philosophy, jurisprudence-moral, where the Bible and all other religious texts were shelved. This was a matter of religious jurisprudence and ethics in philosophy, not of religion. And this book was carried over that day for the swearing in through the tunnel of the Capitol. My favorite moment was as it went through the metal detector. The Capitol police officer, as he handed the box back to me, looked at me and said, "Is this the Koran?" Which made a rare book librarian very happy. And asked if
the officer went for his gun.
No. And he asked if he could see it. And so they all crowded around and looked at it. This was a great moment. And then we arrived, and there's a very long, involved story, but it results in this, which is as the door opened, all of the house was just being released from their official swearing in, and I was clutching this box. The Librarian of Congress was with me, and we had the Sergeant-at-Arms and a crowd that looked like an entourage, but actually were just sort of camp followers. And I said to the Sergeant-at-Arms, "I can do this, but I'm a little uncomfortable. The books aren't so fragile that they couldn't just go through the crowd, but can you help me get to the ceremony?" And he said, this is my one moment that I'll never forget in Washington. And he stepped into the middle of the aisle and yelled out, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Library of Congress has arrived. Please make way." And then, boom.
Akbar Allah.
And so there was this very odd moment of carrying the Koran through the Congress and handing it to, it was a sensational moment. But for me, it was more that the book came back to the building that it had arrived at. This is the 1815 purchase. It survived the 1851 fire. That Koran sat in the Capitol for 35 years before the 1851 fire, and there until it was moved over to the Jefferson building. It was coming home, and for a reason that Jefferson would have loved.
Oh. It's a great story.
That is a great story.
I'm going to ask questions from all of you, or some of you, in a few minutes, but so you might think about that. Before I do, though, I'd like to ask both of you, each of you, to talk a little bit about his letters. The letters to Adams, more than 300, half of them, 158, I think you say, John, come very late.
Yeah.
And you read those letters, and there are issues that are discussed that are contemporary. They're talking about the burning issues of the day. And I wondered about his letters to Adams, but whether they differed in tone or tenor or directness from letters, say, to Benjamin Rush, the doctor, or to James Madison, to whom he at times gave directions. Our whole wide world of friends who contacted him, he seemed to me, it seems to me that he seemed committed to responding to correspondence.
Oh, yes.
Just out of courtesy, not because the issue compelled him, or that it was a magnet that drew him in, but one out of common courtesy. And then there are some letters that seem to, he seems to engage, and I may be wrong about this, and I'm talking to two fellows probably who've read more of his letters than anybody else in this country, in this world. Then there are times when he seems to disengage. Many of the letters to Adams, for example, don't strike me as being anything more than friendly missives, almost saying hello, goodbye. Am I wrong about that?
No, you're not wrong. Forswear that you would be wrong. No. That would knock my world off its axis. So no. No, there are categories of correspondence. TS, correspondence. He writes women. He writes his daughters. He wrote Maria Causeway, a married woman. That was very inconvenient. Arguably, his most famous letter was to her, and it's a debate. It's really an essay. I think it's 3,000 words, isn't it? But an argument between his head and his heart, as he tries to decide what to do about her. I will say this: it is the only love letter that I know of that actually discusses public policy. Well, I take that back. I wrote a couple of those. Take that back. Bill Clinton would. So he wrote women. He wrote them in a different voice, courtly, but took them seriously. And we have no letters between Jefferson and his mother or Jefferson and his wife. He destroyed both those, much to our chagrin. But Washington did the same thing with Martha. There was a kind of cultural code at that point. I would separate his mail correspondence into three categories quickly. One is he wrote a series of avuncular letters to nephews, anyone who wrote him, asked for advice. In fact, he made many reading lists saying, here's what an educated young man should know, that were totally beyond anyone's capacity to actually do. But aspirational lists, I should say. So there are avuncular letters. To Madison, James Madison, I think, played a spousal role in Jefferson's life in many ways. Jefferson would write his most passionately political letters, usually to Madison, almost in the sense, remember Washington described the Senate as the saucer in which we would let the tea cool. Madison was the saucer in which Jefferson's passions would cool. And I don't know about you all, but whenever you have to ask someone whether you should actually send a letter you've written, you probably shouldn't. Just asking means you should. So often Madison would say, oh, this is just a wonderful, wonderful letter. It's so wonderful, I'm going to hold on to it before it's distributed. But they were very practical. Madison was his most important political advisor. He was as important as David Axelrod or Karl Rove or Mark Hanna. Pick your Colonel House, pick your example. Hugely important. And then the Adams correspondence. My sense of the Adams correspondence is, boy, did they know we would be sitting here talking about it. They are essays. They are brilliantly crafted. And, for that generation, fame didn't just mean celebrity, it meant posthumous reputation. When they talked about famous men, they really meant respected men. In the Bible, where it says, let us now praise famous men in Ecclesiasticus, what they're really saying is, let us praise noble forebears, not just people who are well known. And so I think when they wrote those letters, beginning in 1812, they were coming back together. They were bitter rivals. They'd run against each other for president twice. They had not spoken physically since Adams left Washington on the 3rd. They spoke on the 3rd of March, 1801. Adams left Washington on the 4 a.m. stage, so he could avoid the inauguration. So this, Bill Clinton and George Bush were not the first, bromance among former presidents. Adams and Jefferson were. Those letters, I believe, particularly when they're discussing the uses of grief or Homeric poetry or farming, I think were meant to have two purposes. One was to communicate with their old friend. The other, to go to Mark's point, was to make sure everyone remembered the roles they'd played. And the other was to secure a certain reputation in posterity. So just one more quick thing. Adams was always trying to reopen political fights that they had had. Jefferson never took the bait. He did not want to re-argue the Alien and Sedition bills. Adams would have loved nothing better than to refight that. So it's interesting revealing of both men, Jefferson, who hated conflict, direct conflict, and Adams, who really thrived on it. You can see in that later correspondence the character of both men.
Mm-hmm. There's a very unsettled piece between the two of them in their correspondence. I think that comes through. There's a very self-conscious attempt at finding a common ground and staying there. It's also, Jefferson was more comfortable letting go of the political past and going back to what he was really interested in, which was spending his time with books and ideas and accumulating, the commonplace books that Jefferson keeps throughout his life, these short, concise snippets that are broken into categories, continue all the way through. And I think he's most comfortable in this kind of research role. And much of the correspondence that he has with Adams in this period, they discuss the Bible, they discuss God, they go back to the Greek, they talk about the value of Greek. It's sort of an area that's neutral, although you never get the sense that, I never get the sense that Jefferson admires the mind of Adams as much as Adams admires the mind of Jefferson. Jefferson is very, very sparse in his greetings. This might be an 18th century convention, but "my good friend" appears very rarely in the correspondence of Jefferson. In fact, it's shocking when you see Jefferson say, to "my good, dear friend of many years." It's sort of jarring almost. It breaks a kind of cold wall that he has, which is very studied. It goes back to how he approaches. There is a letter between the two of them. It's my favorite. My favorite letter is the Buffon letter, where Jefferson ends up sending body parts to Buffon to set off a scientific argument. But between Adams and Jefferson, this is the beginning of the attempt to reconcile. They don't. This is 1810, I believe, where John Quincy Adams has written a series of essays on rhetoric, which is what bright young Harvard graduates would do. They would publish a series of their papers. And the very proud father, in an effort, I think, to sort of engage Jefferson, sends him a copy of this 2-volume work under separate cover. And then a quick note which says, two pieces of homespun are coming your way. And Jefferson receives the note first, does what Adams hates about Jefferson and what we love about Jefferson, does a sort of long 2.5-page essay about the virtue of spinning cloth at home. And why, although the North is much more mechanized, it seems to him that indeed the cloth in the South is better. And then goes on. And of course the books do arrive. Jefferson dutifully puts them into his collection, but never again acknowledges the books. Adams, in the meantime, has received this letter, and the salutation is scratched into the paper. You can hear the quill going. And then it says, "Dear sir, the two pieces that I sent you were constructed neither of silk, nor linen, nor cotton, nor steel, nor wood, and runs through a whole list, but were in fact sprung from the mind of John Adams. And needless to say, it's a couple more years before they strike up a friendship back to it. But it kind of, for me, summarizes the distance between the two of them. One is, here's my son's work, and Jefferson just sees it as an opportunity to write a nice short essay on homespun cloth.
They, I do think they're joint, and I think this says something to us in our own civic obligations today, not to be too pompous about it. They saw the revolution and this sings out in this correspondence, they saw the revolution as an organic thing in which they had a hand. I can torture this metaphor, but it was a child that had been born. They were seeing it into an unruly adolescence. They hoped it grew to sturdy manhood. But the concern for the country, the concern for an accurate understanding of the revolution and what it meant, is a running theme. Adams says, which is a very sobering thing for those of us who do write about these things, who shall ever write the history of the revolution? Who can ever recapture what those Carpenter's Hall felt like? The spirit of that time. And I think what links all of these things is both men believed deeply in the whole person and the obligation of the whole person to continue to be educated, to continue to read, to continue to farm and garden. Remember, these guys lived forever. I mean, I would have finished this book 2 years earlier if he'd just fallen off a horse in 1812. Jefferson was 82, and Adams was 88 when they died on the 4th of July, 1826. I mean, today that would be, they'd be 150. So they lived forever. They really embodied a kind of Greek ideal, I think, of the whole person.
Questions here always, the best questions come from the audience, and part of it, I saved the best for you. I mean, I haven't asked a question about Sally Heming. I know there's one out there somewhere, more than one. And I haven't asked about the contradiction that dominates much of his whole adult life, and certainly his whole life maybe, that same man who writes the Declaration about all of us being equal is a slave owner and holds slaves at the very time he's describing what a blot it is on our society. Well, how about it? Question. Anywhere, anybody. Yes. Adams.
Go ahead.
Do you remember, this was last year? She's attacked us before. No, this time. Well, you acknowledge that it was an attack last time.
Wait, we have a mic coming for you, I think.
Just to let you all know, John and I were fortunate enough to be guests at one of the houses last year, and this fine,
Lo and behold,
fine undergraduate attacked me about John Adams.
Well, hello, I'm Gina Rossman, the resident Adams fan, I guess. And my question is, you talk a lot about Jefferson's donation to the library. And I would like to know, wasn't he facing a personal financial crisis? Wouldn't you say that also motivated his donation? And how much so?
If you had been present during the first chapter of Genesis, would you have said, why couldn't you get more done in the first 6 days? Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
We'll start off by pointing out that Adams had a collection only half the size of Thomas Jefferson's, and then go from there. Yes, Jefferson was always in need of money. Jefferson had plans for this library. It's also easy to say that if Jefferson was intending to sell his collection to make money, this was the silliest way to do so, because he didn't offer it to Congress with a price attached. He said to Congress, I will sell you this collection as long as you buy the entirety of it, which should give you a clue as to why he wants it to move to. He wants the whole of his work for whatever price you're willing to pay. So as a result, 6,487 volumes sold for less than $24,000. There were books on the shelf in his time period that were worth hundreds of dollars per volume. And if you add it up, this was a really crappy price that he got. And the price was determined by Milligan, a friend in Georgetown, a dealer among other things, who started to appraise the collection for Congress the first chapter that he went to was the ancient history, which is full of classic printings in some cases, but very valuable printings of classical authors, and got through a couple of shelves and realized he's not going to get his way through this list, and came back and said, look, give him $10 for every folio, $8 for every quarto, $6 for every octavo, and $2 for every 12mo, and add it up, and that's what you offer it. So Jefferson believed that a substantial expenditure of his entire fortune, Shadwell, the value of Shadwell was the equivalent of a herd of 200 cattle, or the extension of property twice over. So although there are books we're talking about, this is a fortune. So yes, he was in need of money, and yes, he used that money to offset some debts, but this is not the way to go about it. I don't think it dismisses the beneficence of this, of his behavior. He could have easily have sold it to someone in England, or sold it at auction. So, but I'm sure Adam started that rumor to begin with.
Thank you, and Jefferson wins.
Oh, thank you. We'll see you next year.
There's a question in the back there. There's one on that side and one in the back. Good.
First of all, thank you for coming. This has been great. In addition to your books, John, one of my favorite books is Not Encouraged by Stephen Ambrose. And he talks a lot in there about the education of Meriwether Lewis by Thomas Jefferson. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. I don't know a great deal more than probably what Steve wrote. But Meriwether Lewis was a native of Albemarle County. He was a protege of Jefferson's, his private secretary, before he was sent on the great expedition. He was one of the Ward's nephews, charges, who were given these quite lengthy, quite specific lists of what to read, how many times to exercise a day. It was full of admonitions and maxims about life. And he knew that Lewis would find fortune in the military, and that was the way for him. That was a time, actually, I think of the exact year, where things at Monticello were really not going very well financially. So Lewis had the benefit of a Jeffersonian education with the military side, and then ended up in the right place at the right time. Jefferson didn't have to look very far to find someone to go. He just looked down the hall. The politics of propinquity, I think, is what the academics call it.
Connie has a question.
Actually, I have two. I'm going to be very, very greedy. I want to ask Mark if it's true that he brings the book for the inauguration to the president sworn in to the inauguration.
Which book are you talking about?
Deliver the book that the president sworn in.
The Bible.
The Obama swearing in?
Oh, any swearing in.
Oh, because there is the Lincoln Bible that was used by President Obama twice. I will say this. Given my experience with the Koran, when we suggested to President-elect Obama that since he had used, we're moving presidents here, quoted so often the first inaugural address of Lincoln, perhaps he'd like to use Lincoln's Bible, he said, yes, I envisioned I would have the same experience of marching across the street with the Bible and then showing Michelle Obama how to handle Mr. Lincoln's Bible.
And the Sergeant at Arms would
That's right.
announce
And
you,
ladies and gentlemen, please rise. The Library of Congress has arrived. When I insisted that I couldn't let go of the Bible because it was a national treasure, the Secret Service, and I said I needed to give it to Mrs. Obama, the first response was, no one approaches Mrs. Obama. Well, and secondly, if you persist in wanting to keep it, we will let you do that, but you need to arrive at 3 o'clock in the morning. We will keep you locked in a room in the cabin. And you will come to take the book from you and deliver it to you when you're done. In other words, you sit downstairs. So suddenly I had great trust in the Secret Service. And they're quite capable. So no, I didn't get to do that with the Bible. If that's the question you're asking, no, I'm sorry.
So my other question, John, very quickly, is I may be completely wrong about this. John, did your work in researching Jefferson, did it influence your thinking any about the article that was so brilliant in the Time magazine I referred to? Because you so much talk about the sort of life of the mind liberal arts approach.
Thank you. It's kind of you. You know, I'm a child of the liberal arts. I'm a graduate of the University of the South, which we think of Vanderbilt as the Sewanee of Davidson County. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. The other way to think of Sewanee is Downton Abbey meets Deliverance. So you can take it either way. So I believe deeply in them. I'm sure that writing the sections on the University of Virginia were relevant. But Jefferson is the ultimate liberal arts guy. You know, he spent 2 years at William and Mary. He was heavily influenced by a single professor, William Small. We're very lucky, actually. Small was the vessel which brought the Enlightenment to Williamsburg, and was only there. They only overlapped the 2 years, but Small was only there for 4, I think. And there were George Wythe and others. But it was, you know, Jefferson was like as many people were in those days. He was an autodidact. You know, he was someone who, and there are perils to that. Winston Churchill was self-educated, and Lord knows, you know, you could get an E-Day fix, and it would, you know, suddenly you're at Gallipoli. So it's complicated in that way. I do want to say, I don't think Jefferson. Were you talking about Jefferson himself, his inauguration?
No, I was
Okay.
just thinking of all of the things you put into the book about his intellect and his approach to things and everything.
Thank you.
So I just so echoed the article.
Thank you. I want to ask Mark a question, may I?
Sure.
Am I right that newly inaugurated senators are all given a copy of the Jefferson Bible?
Well, the Jefferson Bible, for those of you who don't know what the Jefferson Bible is, it's a project Jefferson began earlier on and had to table it until his later years, in which, help me with the title, it's the narrative of the life and...
The life and morals of Jesus of
narrative
Nazareth
of the life and
as
morals.
extracted
Yes.
from the gospel.
He went through and destroyed 8 Bibles in the process of doing this, and cut passages from the Bible, and made a glued album of Christ as removing the deity and the miracles, the teachings of Christ as a moral philosopher, who he believed was probably the greatest moral philosopher that had ever walked the earth. But miracles, virgin birth, all of that disappeared. And had it bound and presumably did this for himself and wrote about it a bit. Later on, it in fact was reproduced and then published, and for many, many years was printed by the government printing office, and a copy was given to every member of Congress until about 1959, I think, and then they stopped doing this. Ironically, after the Lincoln Bible event with President Obama, there were a number of requests from individuals who were less familiar with Jefferson than they should have been, who insisted that they really wanted to be sworn in using the Jefferson Bible. I said,
Should have let him.
I really don't think that's what you're looking for.
You're a better man than I am. I would have Lucy in the football bat.
But it was presented to every member of Congress. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a question, I know. I saw the hand.
Thank you. Jim Crimmins, visiting research fellow, Fulbright fellow here at Vanderbilt. I had a brief conversation with Jon Meacham before today's event about Jefferson and the pursuit of happiness, and scholars for basically 100 years have torn their hair out trying to locate the source of that phrase and to divine its meaning. And recently I started pulling my own hair out and trying to do the same. strikes me, though, listening to you talk, that maybe there are some clues that I've yet to encounter, perhaps in Jefferson's books. I'm not familiar enough with what there is still extant and what might be annotated and so on. But are there any clues?
Well, you're asking about the wrong president if you're looking for annotations, unfortunately. He's very blank in his handling of his books, other than a very charming technique of identifying his books with initial letters. Thomas Jefferson almost never writes in his books. But having said that, the Scottish moral philosophers, especially Lord Kames, in my reading, is the beginning of the discussion of pursuit of happiness. Principles of moral, and there are two essays on equity and principles on moral and something or another, Lord Kames in his collection. He writes about Kames early and later, inspiring him to look at this notion in a slightly different stance. And I think that's, in my, and I'm not a scholar of this, but in my reading, it's his telling us this is the beginning of the formation of the idea of pursuing happiness. It's the moral sense school of the Scottish philosophers that focuses on the right to feel established, the right to feel happy.
It's also, I'm sure you're dealing with this, it's also in the Aristotelian sense, it's not what we think of as happiness in the vernacular. It's not smiley faces and Oprah. It's the security of the security and welfare of the state, of the community. It's a Republican lowercase r idea.
Yeah.
We all have an obligation to create a common life that is secure and fulfilling.
There are earlier documents he writes, however, where he plays with this. So the problem with Jefferson is that he published only a few of his own pieces to begin with, so we don't have a large published, and he was reticent for many good reasons, one of which has to do with how he accumulates knowledge in the first place. But there are letters, they're commonplace entries and notes that he makes that suggest this, but it's not, unfortunately, there isn't a correspondence about this. But the material that leads up right to before he leaves for Philadelphia, it seems to be brewing then.
Just a question. Well, both of you have read a lot about Jefferson and Adams. I wonder if either one of you or both of you meet that person face to face, not through letters. Do you find him pedantic, boring, charming? Both. How would you find the person?
Over to you.
Well, Jefferson's complicated. Jefferson does have a reputation of being kind of stiffly charming. He's never quite comfortable in his own skin and settings, but nonetheless, there's a Frenchman who visits him in Monticello, who visits him because of his great stature as the great American thinker, and then writes home and says, I expected a man who was philosophical. What I didn't expect was to find an astronomer, a farmer, and rattles off all the areas of specialization that Jefferson reads about and takes on that persona. So I think he's fundamentally interesting. He plays a fiddle, for Christ's sake, so,
That's the fire at Shadwell. Fiddle, yeah.
And likes theater, although his taste in theater isn't particularly good. But there is an aspect to him. You see it early on. He loses some of that, I think. I think he would be... it's hard not to want to interact with him. There are dinners that happen at Monticello where everyone sits around and talks for hours on end. Something's going on. Adams, I think, is more like a bulldog, and I think it would be just fun to irritate him.
I would say, I agree. If I would not turn down the invitation to meet Mr. Jefferson. But I disagree slightly, or have a different view. I think he was consummately comfortable in his own skin. I think as a Virginia aristocrat, he was never unsure of his place in that world. He was unsure of his place in the political world, which is why I think he focused so much on securing it. There is one negative account of a visitor at Monticello who didn't like him very much in the many travel logs we have. The overall portrait we get is of a very charming, attentive host. John Quincy Adams, who was a terrific diarist, did point out that Jefferson claimed to learn Spanish in 5 weeks. And then there's a pause, and with dry Adams wit, he wrote, "But Mr. Jefferson tells large stories." So there's that. I'm sometimes asked, would I rather meet Jackson or Jefferson? And I have to say it would be Jackson, because the notion, it made sense in the early American Republic for Thomas Jefferson to rise to a position of power. It makes no sense that Andrew Jackson, born at the lowest level of white society, would have made it to that pinnacle. The first 6 presidents of the United States were all Virginia planters or a member of the Adams family. And it was Jackson, the orphan, who made it. So now, it's a riskier proposition to have dinner with Jackson, because
Am I?
you never know how it's going to end.
What's gonna happen at
But
that
that's
time.
why conceal and carry has some virtues.
Am I wrong, John? Was there not a moment when President Madison or Monroe was going to send Andrew Jackson as minister to Russia, and I guess George Washington it was who said, "Why in the name of God would you do that? He'd start a
Yes.
quarrel in a day," or something.
Yes, that feels like a story from the Bible that may be true but not accurate. In the sense that, what I thought you were going to ask is, they intersected briefly when Jefferson was vice president, therefore president of the Senate, and Jackson was briefly a senator from Tennessee. And it was in a high period of anti-Washington feeling outside of Federalist New England. And so Jackson was trying to fight the adoption of a resolution of appreciation for George Washington. Talk about your Pyrrhic fights. And he got so engaged by it that he began essentially to slobber and stammer on the floor of the Senate. And Jefferson always used that story as a sign of, this is a wild man.
Yeah.
Be careful.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. I'm glad there are still hands up. Probably among those hands up, there is a question that won't be asked tonight about Sally Hemings or about the larger question of a person who said we were created equal and still dealt in slaves. Connie, this has been a wonderful experience for me to sit between Mark and John, and with all of you once again. Wonderful discussion, fellows, and let me ask you all to join me in thanking them for their insights.
I don't know about you, but I have been imagining what this evening might be like, and I thought it was going to be fantastic. I could not begin to imagine how fun and wonderful it was. I'm not sure I've ever been to a program that was this terrific. So would you once again thank all 3 of the people that made it that way? I just have a couple of thank yous I have to have, especially the first one, who's thanks to my colleague John Greer, who's the chairman of the Department of Political Science here. He's brilliant, he's a great colleague, but one of the best things he ever did, especially now that I know Vanderbilt is the Swanee of Davidson County.
My work is done.
I have to say that bringing John as a visiting distinguished professor at Vanderbilt, although we've had some fabulous ones, I think John deserves a special call out because it was just brilliant. And we're so lucky. I also have to say that we have so many people from the library, donors, and supporters here. We are so lucky, and we appreciate everything you do, including supporting all our programs.
Now that's the real one.
And I need to mention the brilliance of the chancellor and others here besides John, who were able to lure John here as a visiting professor. And I have to tell you that Mark has been so generous this time. I have to say thank you again, simply because he has honored us more than most institutions. He's been a guest speaker here twice in a year, and we're doing our best to try to get him to come back at least every 6 months. So we really And lastly, I just want to say that it's just the joy of my life to see a gathering like this come together in this newly renovated space. And I have to say a thank you to the best provost in the world, Richard McCarty, because he has been so helpful and supportive, and we wouldn't be here without his work to support the library. So I want to thank you again. I hope that since you found your way here, you'll find your way back again, and we loved having you. Thank you.
Good.
Great job, Sam. Thank you very much. I think we could have done that all.